recording our session now. So before I introduce you to our panel tonight, we'd like to get to know you. We'd like to get to know who's come to the event, and we'd like to get a few thoughts on some questions that help support our discussion. We're going to do this via Slido. So we'd love to get you to go to mentimeter/sli.do. The web address is going to be put into the chat in just a second. This will help gather your thoughts, and we'll have 3 specific questions on there. You can scan a QR code on the screen as the questions come up, or as I mentioned, go to that link in the chat. Very, very simple things. And the first question, as you can see up on the screen, is we'd like you to pick 3 words that describe what you're hoping to get out of today's session. So I'll just give you a minute or so to do that, because obviously what this helps us do is to support our speakers and try to draw out key lessons, key things that you're particularly interested in for today's session. Okay. We know someone wants to really be inspired by the session, which is a good start. So if you, as I say, head to that link or scan the QR code in your phone, this will come up as a word cloud. So we'll be able to kind of get the key thoughts from the audience today. Okay, got a couple more results coming up. Okay, so we can see quite a few responses coming through there, and just as some final ones come through, you can see a big one there is inspiration. So, you know, we're talking about how we can transform the way a museum operates, how we can work towards, you know, making a better organisation and a more inspiring one, I guess, going forward. So hopefully today's session and our speakers will be able to inspire you to go away and make some changes. And hopefully, as again, some big words coming up there, ideas, you know, community, these are big themes that hopefully will be drawn out of the discussion today. New ways of working obviously fits into that. And I think knowledge, I'll just pick out knowledge. We've got 2 excellent speakers who have got oodles of knowledge to contribute to the discussion. So I'm sure they'll be fantastic speakers. So great, thank you for that. Oh, we've got a little, I didn't realize it's going to come up in a bar graph. I was not expecting the bar graph. Oh no, this is a different question. Apologies, I didn't realize it had moved on. So this is our second question. If you could let us know what role you perform in your museum. As I mentioned before, we do support all different parts of museums, all different elements, all different stages of career. It'd be great to get a bit of a handle on what parts of the museum's sector you work in. Okay, so we can already see there's quite a lot of people from management and quite a lot of people from learning who have come today, and I think that hopefully the discussion will really support particularly those 2 streams. I'm sure everyone particularly involved in learning understands that's been a real big difficulty for museums over the last year and slightly earlier than that, as learning departments have been able to, you know, either not function at all or have had to find new ways to function digitally. And of course management, as we start to make changes, I think that's going to hopefully really speak to that. So we've got one final question that's just about to come up. And this is what kind of museum you work in. So again, we'd like to get a bit of a handle on the size and kind of funding elements of the museums you work in to help steer a bit of the discussion today. Okay, again, so we've got a lot of independent museums here and a lot of others I can see as well. So again, I think as we're talking about sort of thinking agile, thinking about change, I think independents have really suffered over the last year. I direct a very small independent, and it's been a big part of our year trying to bring through those change processes. So I think today's discussion will hopefully speak to some of your kind of interests and some of your areas of work today. So thank you very much for filling those in, and as I mentioned before, please do drop any questions throughout today's discussion into our Q&A. So I now want to introduce tonight's speakers. So we have Daniel Pett from the Fitzwilliam, and we have Rebecca Dalley from the Shuttleworth collection. They're both going to talk a little bit now just to introduce their organisations, where they are, and who they are. So I'll pass over, I believe, first to Rebecca.
Sorry, Rebecca, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Rebecca might still be muted.
There we go.
It was not letting me unmute, so now I'm back in control. Thank God, that's the place I like to be. So I just wanted to say hello. My name's Rebecca Dalley. I'm the executive director of the Shuttleworth Trust, which is owns the Shuttleworth collection, and we're in Bedfordshire, as you can see, which is just north of London for those who have never heard of it. Are we going straight to the next slide, May? Great. I just thought it would be useful to just mention we're not in London, obviously, and we're not actually a museum either. We are an educational trust. We do have a big collection. It's mostly industrial collection, as well as being on a large outdoor estate. And our collection's all about preserving skills and knowledge rather than preserving the fabric, as you might do in a museum. So I just thought it would be a useful point to make. If we go to the next slide as well, just to introduce ourselves, we've been very lucky. I'm not going to dwell too much on the fact that how lucky we are to have a huge 1,000-acre estate, because obviously in a lockdown that's quite a good thing to have. But we also have a lot of sort of business areas in terms of a stately home that's got hosts weddings and things. But we have been able to make huge changes this year. We've pioneered things like a drive-in air show. So that's going to shape some of the conversation I'm going to have with you today, which is going to mostly be around the sort of cultural change, how we've worked with our people. So that's us in context.
Okay, and now I'd like to introduce Daniel Pett from the Fitzwilliam Museum.
Thank you, May, for unmuting me. So my name's Daniel Pett. I'm head of digital and IT at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. I'm actually speaking from nearer to Shuttleworth collection than Cambridge. I'm based in Hertfordshire in Tring, and I've been there since, or when would lockdown start? March the 16th last year. That sounds bad, doesn't it? Last year. So the Fitzwilliam Museum was founded in 1816. It's a university museum. It has about 200 staff. It's a very grand building. So, May, do you want to show you the next slide so people can see what it looks like? Because I'm sure not everyone will have been to the Fitzwilliam Museum. It's got very austere outside. It's got a lovely interior. It's very imposing. It's full of art and antiquities. It's got some amazing pieces of work. It's got some really overlooked pieces of work as well. The staff that we have range from conservators to learning to technicians to really wide gamut of museum professions. And in some ways, it thinks of itself as a pseudo-national museum as well. There's other museums in Cambridge as well, which complement this. And we've got about 15 million objects within the collections in Cambridge. It's a huge collection, and it doesn't really do itself justice at the moment. We're selling its stories online. And we've been faced with similar challenges to Rebecca this year with access. Well, all of you, I should think, with how we transform ourselves to deal with COVID and the challenges that come with it. I think that's probably enough for me, so we can actually go on to the discussion and chat. Thank you.
There you go, Joe.
Okay, great. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Rebecca. And if I can just make sure Rebecca and Daniel are both now unmuted, we can begin the discussion. So tonight's theme is transforming the way we operate. So I'd like to start by asking both Daniel and Rebecca to just give us a couple of words, I guess. What does being sort of agile operationally mean to you? What does it mean to sort of work in an agile way? Let's start with Rebecca.
Oh, start with me. Okay, Agile for me is about flexibility, and it's something that I've worked always in national museums, which is one of the reasons that I know Joe, because we worked in the National Museum together, and it's something that museums are uniquely challenged by. So Agile, I think, is so important right now, which is why I was so keen to talk to everybody, because it's that flexibility and that ability to trust people to think outside the box and then do stuff without having 10 layers of oversight is a real challenge in your industry, in our industry. I'm now in an independent museum, and I'm also the boss, so that helps. But I do recognise just how different it is for me and how challenging it is for everyone else.
Fantastic. And Daniel, what does being agile mean to you?
Agile, interesting phrase, isn't it, with museums? It means moving quickly and easily. And I think most of you know that museums aren't very good at that. This governance structures stop you doing that sort of thing, especially if you've had a background working in national museums, which I think Joe has, and Rebecca says she has, and I have. And I think a few people on this call have as well. But it's also, Agile's got connotations for IT process management as well, about working different ways. But I think Agile at the moment is about museums really adapting to the situation and trying to actually stay alive. About 8 years ago, Dominic Treadle, who some of you may know, director of the Royal Naval Museum, said that a lot of museums are going to fold and disappear. And he hadn't thought about this at the time. And we're going through that phase where we have more constraints now. When he was talking about it, it was about people not having enough funding. So at the moment, I think a lot of agileness is about how you can actually bring funding into your organisation while actually still managing to keep people working. And I think we're going to come on to that with the questions that follow on from this. So I think that's what Agile means to me at the moment. It's about adaptiveness.
It's interesting. I just want to pick up very briefly on something you both mentioned, which is the difference between nationals and independents. Because we saw obviously in the Slido responses, there's a lot of people here from nationals. And I think it's definitely an experience I've had, and you both touched on it, that the kind of the red tape and all of that stuff you have to fight through at nationals is quite a difficult thing. So I think it's just worth noting that I guess if you're sitting there thinking it's difficult to do in a national, you're completely heard. It definitely is. But I think there are ways around it, and hopefully some of the ideas we'll talk about today might be of use. And I think particularly, again, coming back to the funding note that Daniel mentioned, that's something that really helps you be agile. Is if you can bring money with your idea, people at senior level are going to go with it a lot more than if you just want to, I don't know, do something which maybe costs money. That's the harder sell. So I think let's move on to your specific organisations. Let's start with Daniel. It'd be great to hear about some changes that's happened at the Fitzwilliam Museum during 2020, and what your kind of experience with those operational changes might have been.
Joe, do you want them from my specific area that I work in, or just generally for the organisation?
Well, I think it'd be good to hear from your personal experience, but if there's anything else from the organisation that'll be particularly of interest, please do bring that in. Okay.
I think generally during this lockdown period and what's happened since and the previous ones, we've been through massive organisational change about how we work, how people actually perceive work, whether they actually want to come back to work in the building, whether museology is actually changing forever with what we're up to now as well, and how visitors are going to consume the content that we might actually be putting out or not consume the content. We're all fighting for the same space at the moment, and there's a lot of noise and people are trying to find the signals that they really want to listen to. We've gone through a massive change in our staff's ability to work. So at the beginning of lockdown, and I think Rebecca will have found this as well, and I think many of you work in museums, that most of our staff were not equipped to work at home. They didn't have IT equipment. And I've just surveyed our staff again to find out how many people have actually got equipment provided by the university. It's only 50% of staff have got IT equipment from the museum now. The rest of us are working at home on goodwill on the equipment they have. I'm included in that goodwill thing. I don't have any museum equipment. I work on my own IT equipment. And I went through the same thing at the British Museum. I always worked on my own stuff at home there because it's what I wanted to do and I was comfortable with it. And a lot of people didn't have skills to actually work with this stuff. And a lot of people still aren't very comfortable with things like Zoom or Google Meet or Teams. And they're trying to adapt their working life to work with digital technology that they might not be happy with. So when we started off in lockdown, the first survey I did with our staff, about 10% of staff thought they had good IT skills. We've just repeated that survey last week. It's now gone up from 10% to 60% thinking they've got good IT skills. Now, that's their self-perception. They're not benchmarking against anything else, but it's how they felt they've got on over that time. And I think that's a really good, as people call a win in the situation, that people are now feeling confident. And IT calls are now going down drastically. So we're now down to about 4 calls a week for our IT desk of things to do. Does that mean our IT staff are redundant? No, definitely not, because there's other stuff they're doing, like maintaining systems. Many museums didn't have, say, VPN access to their networks at the start of lockdown. Now, we're very lucky. We're supported by a university, so with the infrastructure there. But Rebecca might have to go out and hire that in from elsewhere. Many other museums sit on other people's hardware and infrastructure. So we are lucky that we get these sort of things. I think the other thing we had to deal with, and I think Rebecca might talk about this as well, is we didn't have a ticketing system in place for allowing people into the building at the very beginning. We've got one very quickly, and I think Rebecca said that the very first time we met, we got one quickly. We've got quite a large ticketing system. We've gone for Tessitura, which costs quite a lot of money, but it's also CRM. It's meant to bring money in. But donations are hard to get at the moment. We all know that. People don't want to give their money away easily. I'd rather donate it to a food bank, for instance, than give it to a museum, personally. So I think we've gone through massive change, operations, digital, people, and those 200 people who are there, some have gone furlough, and there's this sort of jealousy of people who are in work still, and the people who are at work are sort of saying, I wish I had some time off as well. And we're now seeing that change where more people are going on to flexi furlough because of childcare. So from this week, I'm doing Monday and Fridays as flexible furlough, but I've still got all that work stacking up that I need to do in a shorter period of time. So that's quite scary. So I think I'll stop talking there, because I was speaking about 4 or 5 minutes, and give Rebecca a chance to say how hers has changed.
Yes, it'd be good to hear, Rebecca, about some changes at Shuttleworth.
Yeah, so we, as an independent museum, and one that wasn't terribly flush with cash to start with, we got straight onto our cash flow and realised that we were going to be in deep doo-doos within, not quickly, but actually over the long term, because we're a very summer orientated organisation, because we have a lot of outdoor space. So we did a very big restructure very early on, because we were very reliant on hospitality, and a big cafe that you could access off the road, and we also had a wedding and events business that we could see was not going to be sustainable. So we lost about a quarter of our staff in that restructure. Then we made a change where a very siloed organisation that had, it's quite a complicated organisation with the collection, we've got the Mansion House, we've got gardens, and they all used to be run by different organisations. So they had retained huge silos, and we just swept that all away, and almost using COVID as an excuse for something we might have wanted to do anyway, we created a single point of entry with a paywall, which we hadn't had before, so that we were collecting obviously the test and trace names and addresses all the way through, hence the need for a ticketing system very quickly. And then had to go ask everybody to just go all hands on deck. Everyone had to do everything, because we didn't have the same staff levels that we had before. And it was a great opportunity for us to break down some of the barriers between the different silos of the organisation. And I'm sure we'll come on to talk about how that worked. It also allowed for great getting people to be quite creative about what we were going to do, because we had to throw out all of our indoor events. Obviously, as you can imagine, we already do air shows and some outdoor events, so we had to double down on all of that and just go out to everyone and say, what's your idea? Tell us what you can think of to generate revenue through the summer while we can, which ended up particularly successfully with our drive-in air shows. And we were amazed to discover we were pretty much the only people in the UK that managed to get air shows off the ground. And we were also, it turns out, real trailblazers in the US, because they didn't manage to do anything until September. So we're starting to win some quite nice little awards for that work. So it was a fairly wholesale change.
I was going to say, it's excellent to hear. That's a real sort of success story that's come out of that. And I suppose it's an opportunity that you can model and trial in the future. There's a couple of things to pick up that you've both mentioned, but the first one I wanted to talk about very briefly was about ticketing systems, which sounds boring. But there will of course be plenty of people within the event today who maybe their museum hasn't opened, maybe they couldn't get social distancing in, maybe they just didn't have the funding to do so. It was interesting to me because my experience was slightly different to both of you. We didn't have, we had a single point of entry, but we didn't put in a booked ticketing system at the Cartoon Museum, which is where I work. I wondered what your thoughts were on introducing that single point of entry, that ticketing system, if you feel that's something that's really essential for all sites to do. Let's start with Daniel, sorry.
I think that's a really hard question to go sort of generalise over all sites, because we're all very different in the way we work. I think for us in Cambridge, it was essential for what we're doing because we've got quite a large building estate where people can get around. But we've also rolled the ticketing out from what was just meant to be Fitzwilliam to all of the Cambridge museums now, so that we can actually track and trace all the people who are coming onto our venues. So we are complying with the law. But what we have done is we're now asking for so much information that people are finding it a little bit invasive on their life. What they want is a frictionless sign up with one click. So many of you will use systems where it's say Google sign up, where you just click the button and it goes through. But that's not good enough for what we've generally been doing. And we're now data mining in a very different way as well. But we're asking people for what they've seen and what they like. And we're trying to personalize emails that are going out. Now, is that ethically correct either? That's the thing. How much data should we collect from our visitors? How much is too much? And are we getting that single customer view where we can then say, Rebecca went to see this air show and she also bought this Airfix model in the shop. Should we send the Messerschmitts or should we send the Spitfires? That sort of thing as well. But ticketing is also that CRM side where that person could then be targeted for, they've been to see this show in the past. Would you perhaps donate money to buy this Rembrandt, for instance? So they are quite clever, but they're also a bit invasive on your visitor. But at the moment, they're necessary. Now, will we go back to not having one in the future? I think no, not at the moment. The costs are quite high. And I think this is one thing that all of you who are perhaps in small museums are thinking, how do I actually get access to that? And there is a big digital divide between museums. You go to conferences and people say, museums must do this. Now, the single curator museum says, I can't afford to do that. I've got one member of staff who does the digital, that's me. I've got one member of staff who does the curation, that's me. I clean the floors as well. So, but there are open source solutions out there and low cost and small models that you can buy. And maybe this is something you could be bidding for money from the Cultural Recovery Fund as well at the moment to say, I need help to put this sort of system in. And without that, we cannot operate because we cannot collect people's addresses and names. Otherwise, it's a piece of paper. And then what have you got? You've got a GDPR problem because that piece of paper is on your front desk and you disappear for 5 minutes and someone picks it up or you throw it away. There's all those stories about lecturers from universities putting marking down in the bin and then the cleaner throwing it out. That sort of thing could happen in your organisation as well. So I think those ticketing systems are really essential at the moment, but hopefully we'll go back to freedom of movement at some point, and then the ticketing is just for you getting people into events and maybe donations and whatever else that comes up. Rebecca, what do you think?
Well, we were an organisation with not a great marketing track record, if I can be polite. And we really didn't have a database. So anybody out there who works in the marketing areas of their organisations, although we sold tickets for air shows, we didn't have any kind of advanced ticketing for day-to-day access to the garden or the sort of collection when being used as a museum. And you could also access our site outdoor areas and a playground for free. So suddenly having we managed to put 35,000 people through our attraction this year. Some of those are friends and members, but suddenly having that data has been absolutely transformational for us, because then when we were going out for our decisions to say, right, we're going to do a lights event in the garden, we're going to do a fireworks event, we're going to do a anything we can think of that's outside. We were selling out within hours, not sort of struggling to sell stuff. So if you don't have a ticketing system and suddenly having that data and not in a format that some poor person has to type in to an Excel spreadsheet, which is the tiny museum way, is absolutely amazing. It was completely amazing for us. We went for a real off the shelf job because we opened really early with the gardens. We were open on the 4th of June, I think. And it was a horrid realization that the system that we had for air shows wouldn't give us capacity limits. So we just did a Google search, give me a good ticketing system, and came up with one, and it was literally me that set it up because everyone else was on furlough. So it had to be pretty idiot proof. It's not massively cheap, but it's not difficult, and it's been brilliant for allowing us to. It's really easy to create the little events that we have where we're not charging anything extra, but you need to book because we needed to limit capacity, especially when the rule of 6 came in. So we opened our big mansion house, which is normally a wedding venue, so that people could come around, but we had to limit the numbers, and so people had to book a slot. So it had to be really easy, and it had to be on the same platform that they're booking their day-to-day tickets. So it's been super, super easy for that as well, and then gives people real confidence. So for us, it's been a really, really good experience.
I think that's a really interesting kind of example, and the kind of really good thing to pull out of this is that that was an opportunity that arose that maybe both your organizations wouldn't have gone with otherwise, but there's clearly value being added to the organization from it, and it kind of shows that despite, I guess, the year that we're having, there are these things that can sort of come out of that to help to drive some of the change that you maybe strategically want to do already. And this kind of brings me on to something that was kind of echoed by both of you, and it was sort of summed up quite nicely by a question from Beatrice. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong. But yes, speaking about flexibility and nimble action, she was wondering, is the values throughout the organisation, top to bottom, are they shared? Is that something that really affects that change happening? Because when you're talking about breaking down silos in different areas of the museum, or even the fact that there's this big percentage increase in IT skills, these are things that previously would be completely separate. You would either take for granted or you wouldn't even think about. And this has created an opportunity to break down some of those barriers. Is that something driven all the way through the organisation, or has that been something that's been I don't know, a difficult change to implement? Let's start with Rebecca.
We were on the path for quite a lot of change because I'm relatively new, and that's what new bosses do. And we had done some work. We actually got one of the very last of the lottery's Resilient Heritage Fund grants to do some strategic sort of unpicking of the organisation and have a look under all the stones. So we'd looked at the corporate culture really early on, which had been very traditional, very sort of anti-change, very insular, actually, to be honest. And then we've done the same exercise again after just a few weeks ago to create a set of, we're not really calling them values, we're calling them principles, because some of them are about our behaviours and some of them are a little bit more about what we actually do. But it's been really clear for us that creating change, and particularly we've looked at empowering our staff, has created a culture of opportunity for people that's very different to the culture that was there before. And one of the things that we've really had to challenge is, and this will be a continuing issue, is around that sort of judgment of people when they're trying something and it doesn't quite work. Because if you're going to change into being a slightly more entrepreneurial culture, which we've absolutely had to do just to keep the show on the road, you have to be able to fail, and you have to be able to allow people to fail. And even it's been very interesting unpicking where that judgment comes from, because I had assumed it had come from the senior managers or the trustees or the outside world. But what we've realized is that actually that culture has come from everyone's peers. That the one department says, well, we're all trying to save money and you've just wasted it because what you tried didn't work. And actually that's really, really, really toxic. So it's a real challenge to, from the top, get everybody on board with allowing somebody to try and fail as long as those lessons are learned. We won't tolerate consistent failure, but we are absolutely allowing people to say, I think this is a great idea. You know, here are my numbers. Here is the rationale. Here's the people I think are going to be interested in it. You know, and run with it. And if it doesn't work, you know, fine. We don't do it again, or we learn, or we take the good bits from that experience. So culturally, I think that's been one of the hugest lessons for us in this period.
And Daniel, have you felt a similar kind of level of support throughout the Fitzwilliam? You know, have you felt there's even been a greater appreciation of the work your team does?
I'll come on to that in a second. I was just going to say a little bit about, so we're about to go through a reorganisation change as well. We have a new director who's been posted about a year, and he started off with a mission review of the organisation to decide where our shared values were. And I think we might be talking about change management again in another question, but we are going to go through that process. And at the moment, there's been no talk about a change management model within the organisation. But what I feel we're looking at really is McKinsey's 7S model, with the very hard elements that come up at the very beginning, the strategy, structure and system of the organisation. And then something Rebecca mentioned about shared values. And that's what Beatrice has asked about, whether the organisation has shared values from top to bottom. And I think to achieve that, you have to be very transparent about what changes you're going to make from the very beginning. And I think I've been to 2 museums now, and I've worked in an investment bank. And what's been very apparent in all of those places is that information is not very transparent to the employees. People are very scared of change. People have invested a lot of their lives in these museums. So some people have been at museums for 20 years, maybe even longer. And you're never going to change their life forever by saying their job role is changing, that silo has disappeared. So let's say I work in coins and medals and someone else works in the Department of Egyptology, and you decide that you don't want those siloed departments anymore. You lose a large part of your life because that identity is part of that. Now, when I was at the British Museum, the best Christmas party was Greek and Roman. Everyone wanted to go to that department's party. You wanted to belong to that part at that time of the year. But everyone goes back to their departments and becomes part of that department again once they've gone back. So I think this is what Rebecca's been saying, that it's trying to break down those silos. It's really, really hard. And I first came across silo mentality in 2001. And we keep talking about it. And everyone keeps talking about it. And their businesses are siloed completely. You all have your business units and you feel part of that. So it's a hard process, and I think every organisation is probably going through quite a hard process at the moment. You might have a team of 3 people or a museum of 3 people, but you all have conflict about what you want the place to do and what change it should go in. And I think we're all thinking about what our museum should be there for. We all have different ideas, but it's how do you synergise those and bring them back together and think that's what I want to be part of. Because if your employees don't want to be part of that change, you're set up to fail. And Rebecca mentioned failure several times there. Funders don't want you to fail, but we should not be scared of failure, because some things we do are just not going to work with the public or audience. So Rebecca mentioned doing drive-in air shows. That's quite a big gamble in some ways, but Rebecca probably knew it was going to work because it's been done somewhere else. Drive-in movies work, but your audience might not want to do that. But if you don't try it, how do you know it's not going to work? And that's something that, say, Ed, who's on the call from British Museum's Samsung Discovery Centre, he does so much experimentation with the work he's doing. And I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I've seen the experiments they've been doing there, and they're fantastic because they try new things out with people, and the audience comes back. That's the important thing, isn't it? That people come back if they like what you're doing. If they don't like what they're doing, you know your experiment's not been working. So it's a way to work out what you're up to. I've lost track. What was the first part of that question you asked me, Joe?
I think we kind of covered a lot of it, because it was more about, you know, within the institution, how do the values kind of cascade downwards. But, you know, I think what you're talking about there, particularly fear of failure, you know, and that siloing, that is, in my opinion, they're 2 things that sit right next to each other. People silo because they're you know, afraid of change or afraid of doing something and stepping outside their boundaries. So I think they kind of link together quite nicely. You mentioned about change models a second ago, so it'd be good to hear a little bit from both of you about specific change models you might be using at the moment or have used in the past to good effect. Daniel, would you like to continue, as you were sort of talking about it just now?
Well, I think for my job, we've got 2 types of change management. We've got the stuff for the IT process, which at the moment doesn't really exist and hasn't done there. But that's a little bit like organisational change. You've got a problem, you need an answer, and you need a process to get to that point. And you need to be able to work out some way to actually work out whether that change has been effective, whether you can roll it back. And that's part of what we're trying to do. But then you've got the formal project management and change management models that have been worked on for years and years. So May's put one link in for the McKinsey one that I mentioned earlier. There's other really famous ones as well. There's so much reading you can do around change management. But I think a lot of people who work in museums have never been exposed to business models. and how these things go in. And so you're starting to see a lot of places bring in business analysts to work out problems, or bring in external contractors to actually work on things. So May's studying stuff like this, I think, at Cambridge at the moment. And you learn business processes you can apply. I think one thing that we're very scared of in museums is actually becoming a business as well, and thinking along business principle lines, because we are museologists. We're interested in objects, we're interested in people. We're perhaps not so interested in making money, but that's changing over time. And I think that's the problem, is that we're still set in the sort of Wonderkammer type mentality, that place of public wonder that people want to come to and learn things. We're not really set up to become that place that's making money, keeping people in work, bringing people through the doors, making sure the air conditioning works, that sort of thing. What's the biggest change for organisations? It's probably mentality of staff rather than some of the other things. It's about making everyone want to be part of that common goal. Is there a common goal for your organisation? It's perhaps the first thing you should ask yourself when you join a place. And I'm still not quite sure I know what the goal of the places I've worked in has been, actually. Even though we've just been through a mission review, I'm still hearing different things from my staff who are around me. And they're so scared of change that you get them in tears sometimes. I have a team of 13, and you say, we'd like to do this new thing. And they say, well, how does that affect me? And is it going to make me do new things that I haven't learnt about? So going back to the IT skills at the very beginning, people were very scared about working remotely. And when we said, you can't break things, just try it, that made a difference. But with change management and stuff about changing the organisation, you can't go back sometimes because you made people leave. And that's the thing that most people are really scared of. And there's a few comments in chat about redundancies and loss and furlough, and the fact that when people are on furlough, you can't communicate very well. And I'd be interested to know how Rebecca's managed to communicate with her staff through furlough. One thing we introduced was a weekly newsletter, and that went out to all staff in the museum. That's just a MailChimp type thing, and that was quite transparent, just to a degree. For my team, we had a daily stand-up, which was optional, so you could come to for 15 minutes and talk about the problems you had and whether you needed help with something. And that worked really well for the first 3 months of lockdown. And then people got very disheartened. It was about, I'm a bit fed up with doing this now. So we've changed our model to once a week. And then we found out people didn't really want to do that. So now we're doing once a month for that sort of thing, and trying different ways of communicating.
Yeah, I think one thing that's quite interesting you're sort of touching on there is about kind of measures of success. Because even just saying, like, when do people want to come to a get together or read a newsletter? And I think that's a big part of kind of knowing if a change model is being successful. I wonder, Rebecca, if there was a change model you'd like to talk about, or be able to talk about your experience using, and if there are any of these kind of, I guess, almost like KPIs to know if it's actually successful. Is it an increase in visitor numbers? What might it be?
Well, I think I mentioned that we started off with a Resilient Heritage grant, so we were already halfway through, or 2/3 of the way through, picking apart the organisation. We were not using a specific model, I have to confess. I've been through and been quite instrumental in a big change program in another museum, and again, part of that, there was a part of that which where we partnered with an organisation using theory of change. So I was quite familiar with that, but as an organisation that is quite on the sort of the mainstream margins, if you like, I felt that trying to layer on a very formal process was really going to switch people off very quickly from a new face like mine. So my change management strategy has also been coloured by the fact that I've been very, very hands-on, and I've been running the air shows as the event director, so I've been down with the kids the whole time, and that has been more useful than anything else, because most of the things that I do have been generated by all the staff saying, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, why I get annoyed with this. Because I could pay a management consultant to tell me that, but I might as well tell my staff. And what management consultants do is that they then create the beautiful models and the lovely data sets, and and reflect that back to trustees. Well, to be honest, give me a word cloud and I'll do that myself, thanks. So as Joe knows, so I'm afraid I'm a bit skeptical about the big models, which I think probably work in a very large organisation. But for a very small organisation, they can push you into trying to change things that are not broken, and they can miss. I suspect they can slightly miss the point, which is exactly as Dan said. Most of it's about changing mindsets, and the easiest way to get around that is going to talk to people, because you very quickly find out that there are some people who are never going to change, and that's fine. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to be part of the organisation. It just means that you have to sometimes make allowances for that, and just accept it and say, and as long as their behaviours are acceptable, then that's fine. You don't have to agree with me. That's not going to change the way that the organisation's going to move.
Yeah, I think that's that kind of really chimes what you were saying earlier about sort of empowering your staff, and again chimes with what Daniel was saying. People within museums that might be frightened of, becoming a business or whatever, so they just deliberately sometimes, or just not through opportunity, being exposed to things like business management and that's where you end up bringing in consultants who obviously cost a lot of money as well. And right now everyone's trying to save money. So we've got one sort of final question I'll get onto in just a second, but before we move to the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll come to them in just a second. So I think there's a few things that we've really kind of pulled out of the discussion, and I think breaking down particularly silos and how you might be able to do that if you're not in management, that's an interesting point. How you can become exposed to things that help your organisation to change, and how can you become more involved in empowering your staff. These are quite sort of important things. Is there any particular advice that either of you would give to the museum professionals within this event about how they could go away and start to operationally transform their organisations and try to, I guess, empower them? Rebecca, is there something you could sort of speak to particularly that you'd want people to take away?
I think that with any luck, your organisation has a strategic plan. Not all of them do. I'm just writing the very first one for Shuttleworth, so it's not a given. But if you've got a good idea that you want to get off the ground, see if you can fit it into one of the themes of the strategic plan, because it's one of the sort of bits of catnip for a big organisation, that you're looking at the wider environment, and especially if it's a short-term change, can you see how it's going to benefit the organisation on the other side as well? We were so lucky with all of our changes that we had already sort of identified the areas that we wanted to change, and therefore we really managed to use COVID as a bit of an excuse to try them. It comes back to that trying stuff before you buy. But I recognise it's really difficult if you've got a culture that's not very tolerant of failure. So if you can start small as well, I'm a huge fan of. You can have a grand idea, but if you can work out a way to start it in a small way, rather than go in with both feet and all guns blazing, then it just allows you to test it out and scale it up.
Okay, and Daniel, what's your thoughts you'd like people to take away?
Well, I think it's quite hard actually, because each operation is slightly different, and is there an opportunity for you to put your idea to management? I think Rebecca talked about being very hands-on, inclusive with her staff, and I think that makes a big difference. I come from a sports background. I played a lot of rugby when I was younger, and I saw some great leaders. Keith Wood, the Irish hooker, used to talk to us a lot when we were Colts at Harlequins about how much it was about being part of a team. And some of the stuff that they talked about has gone with my career as well, and seeing what's happening. The British Museum, Neil McGregor used to know everyone's name in the organisation and walk around and say hello to people. And then they had a new director come in, Hartwig, and I don't think he's doing the same sort of thing in the same way. I think in the organisation we're in now, Luke's trying to make contact with all the staff, but you have quite a large staff. Now, is there an opportunity for you to speak to the director directly and give them your ideas? How does that mechanism get across in the first place? And like Rebecca said, does it fit with the strategic plan? You've also got to remember that there's limited opportunities in the museum world for getting into management in the first place, because it's quite a small sector and people don't move on. Like I mentioned earlier, people can be for 30 years in a job. Some of you may only have one opportunity if you're curated to become keeper of antiquities at a certain museum. So you've got to look for opportunities. Some of those opportunities out there are mentorship as well, and things like doing an AMA with the Museums Association, or looking for opportunities that might fit with your career set. Don't let anyone ever tell you you can't do something as well in your mind with your career. There's opportunities there where you can bend. If the place doesn't give you what you need, don't be afraid of leaving. You can always come back, unless you really annoy them. And that's something. I'm not sure I'm ever going to be welcome back at the British Museum, but that's a different matter. But you've got to find something that keeps you going as well, an opportunity to develop. And one of the things you get with HR is when you go and say, I'm not getting many opportunities to develop myself at your museum or your venue, they'll quite often say, well, are you finding things for yourself that you want to do? Not everything costs money. There are courses you can do for free out there. There are things that you can do, like go and find volunteering opportunities to help you with your career. So be a bit strategic about what you want to do. There's stuff that you can learn from your peers as well. You could ask to shadow someone like Rebecca, or you could look for the Claw leadership fellowships and things like that. So don't give up hope about actually making operational change. There's opportunities there, you just got to find them. And I think things like this are really useful because you can actually find some ideas from other places and say, this is an example of a small institution like mine that's done something and they made a big difference. You could go away and say, you said earlier, we've raised £130,000 donations. I'm not going to say how much we've raised for the Fitzwilliam because I'll get shot in the same period, but it's not the same. You've done it really well. Should we talk to you about how you've done that? I think in some ways, yes, if you're willing to talk about that sort of thing. So don't be afraid of asking people questions as well. One of the other big things that's really helped my career is Twitter. And that's for making relationships and networks as well. I've now had lots of research collaborations with America from people I've met on Twitter through just random conversations where we've actually got together and we've done research bids. We've brought in £500,000 research over the last year doing that sort of thing. And that's basically just making contact and saying, we've got shared interests, could we collaborate? And I think Twitter has actually broken down boundaries quite a lot, or social media. You can now go to a conference, you've got a shared thing to talk about because you've met people randomly, say, I know you from this and we talked about that. Whereas before it's like, I'd like to talk to you because you're famous and I've read your book, which is a little bit sort of fanboyish or fangirlish. So there's things to do and don't give up hope about moving your career on or your operation. Has that answered the question?
I was going to say, I think that's a really good sort of place to move on to Q&A actually, because for a start, that is, people having the opportunity to ask questions of experts. But I think it's also, what you're summing up quite nicely there is why something like the London Museums Group exists. We're here to sort of foster those connections and encourage peer-to-peer networking. And there's been a lot of conversation back and forwards in the chat, which has been great to see throughout this event. So yeah, I think Daniel's got a really important point there, which is you can develop yourself very easily through networking, through meeting, and just asking people questions if you've seen they've done something interesting. And that's something that's definitely helped me throughout my career. So I think we'll move on to Q&A for the last sort of 6 or 7 minutes we have. I think we'll start with, this is a kind of a comment, but I think it kind of points to a broad question that from Kirsten Forrest, that I suspect most organisations, the pandemic has showed up cracks in sharp relief. And there's a kind of question there about, particularly within your own institutions, has the onset of coronavirus just suddenly shown this is a big issue, we need to address this, and we weren't even looking at it before? Rebecca, was there something like that that's happened at Shuttleworth?
I think it would have, had we not started on really leaving apart those cracks, as with the research we were doing in order to create a new strategic plan. So we were well aware of where those cracks were, and actually for us, as a result, it was a fantastic opportunity to to close the cracks or work out a way to maneuver around them, and actually a fantastic way, not knowing whether the solutions were actually going to work, to be able to trial it and say, hey, it's COVID, if it doesn't work, that's great. So like creating a new single point of entry in a completely different place, totally new routing through the site, and will people actually pony up 15 quid to get into our site when and most of them have got in for pretty much for free? Well, we would have, if we'd had full year, we'd have had more visitors this year than we have had in a normal year ever for day-to-day visitors, and that's starting in June, having half or most of our indoor spaces closed, and we did lockdown in November, but the rest of the time we stayed open. So but I had to be fully prepared to throw the baby out, if it hadn't worked. There was always the option of going back if it wasn't going to work. And that allowed us to create that entrepreneurial culture as well. And then people are more keen to both point out the cracks in their environment as well when they've got a stake in the solution. So again, I'm a very small organisation in the great scheme of things. And also, I have to say, I employ all our own staff. So all the cleaners, all the maintenance guys, all of the, absolutely everybody, all the, cooks and catering staff. So actually, they are, you're always getting the real horse's mouth when you go for a chit chat. And so I've been very lucky that those cracks were there. They were huge, but we were already on that trajectory of filling them.
And Daniel, is there anything that, quickly that sort of really was opened up, I should say, at Fitzwilliam that wasn't before understood?
I'm not sure I've understood. I think the point made by Kirsten about a shift for wellbeing, learning and families and young people, it's sort of given those departments more of a chance to shine about what they can do. And we've got all these elements that come into play now. So home learning, about museums putting out content that might be relevant. We've got a big gamut of museums and all sorts of things that could be done. Wellbeing is something that the museum I work in has been focused on for quite a long period of time. They've been doing research around this generally. And Cambridge is one of the most disadvantaged cities in Britain at the moment. You've got the town and gown divide. You've got places like Wisbech, which have got low levels of literacy, really big degrees of poverty. So there's all sorts of stuff that we're now perhaps putting more into the spotlight, and knowing that that's where funding might come from as well, from the government or from the Arts Council or wherever the thing might come from. Philanthropists might say, I'd like to help out with that sort of thing. But the news recently has been showing things like how people aren't getting the right sort of help to get food. Where do museums fit in with this as well? We did a show on food last year. It was all about the opulence of food. Maybe that was badly timed because it was all about the wrong sort of thing for some people's eyes. But we're now seeing ICOM redefining what museums are for as well. And what are museums for? Are they for participation? Are they for people to have a one-way didactic experience? Or is it about well-being and about being a place of solace at the moment? And that's a really hard question to get our heads around. And some museums cannot deal with that because they don't have enough staff. And it's a shift of their mission completely. And where do they fit in? So some of us are going to be very lucky and become sort of exemplars that we can cite and say we've done really well in COVID. But that's because we might have won funding as well. And some museums are getting lots of funding and some aren't. So there's that disparity, and perhaps some people are going to get a bit dispirited. I was just looking through the chat questions to see if anyone's brought out things that I can say on from this.
I think we're now, to be honest, about a minute out from the end of the session.
Okay.
So unfortunately, I don't think we've got time to cover any more questions. But thank you for sending in your question. We do appreciate that. And we'll have to wrap up there. But obviously, there's so much more discussion that we could be having. Thank you so much to everybody for coming to the event. Thank you to Rebecca and to Daniel for sharing their thoughts. And please do, of course, come to the future events we're running. And also thank you to May and Nikki and Cheryl, who've been supporting from the London Museum Group side behind the scenes. So thank you very much. And please do sign up to the London Museums Group if you're not already a member. Thank you and have a good rest of your evening.